Welcome to the debate, the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Here was a figure who really built his entire national brand around, this vigorous defense of free speech. And then instantly his death triggers one of the most aggressive, really far-reaching censorship campaigns we've seen in recent American memory. So the resulting crackdown, the firings, the media blackouts, the government threats, was it a necessary, maybe nonpartisan defense of civic life against political violence? Or was it just the most stunning, cynical display of political hypocrisy we've ever witnessed?
Yeah, that is the ultimate high-stakes question, isn't it? It's right there at the heart of the official record. And we're diving deep into those ambiguities, those conflicting agendas hidden beneath the headlines of this, seismic political event, right now, here on the KaiZen channel. The whole narrative is fractured, and the implications, especially for the First Amendment, they're massive. So, get ready to have your perspective fundamentally challenged.
Okay, so our central disagreement today is basically this. Did the public and political response to Charlie Kirk's assassination actually clarify America's commitment to free speech and justice? Or did it expose a fundamental hypocrisy, turning a tragedy into, essentially, a weapon for political censorship? I'm going to argue that the response was fundamentally a necessary, nonpartisan societal rejection of political violence, an attempt to restore some basic order.
And I come at it from a different way. I really believe the response was a transparently partisan campaign, a campaign of coercion and censorship. It amounts to a political purge, really, that directly betrayed the very principles of open discourse that Kirk himself, claimed to champion.
All right, before we dig in, we want to hear from you first, our fantastic KaiZen listeners. If you believe the country overreacted, launched a hypocritical crackdown targeting speech, write 0 in the comments right now. If you think the dramatic actions taken were justified, necessary to restore order, and condemn political murder, write 1. Let us know where you stand right now. Okay, so my position, it's rooted in stability, right? And the need for a clear, unified moral response when political homicide happens. Look at the immediate consensus. The assassination prompted this overwhelming bipartisan condemnation, and this was actually codified by the House of Representatives passing House Resolution 709.
Okay, H.R. 709. It's a simple statement, isn't it? Condolence and condemnation. Pretty standard.
But its overwhelming passage, with over 150 co-sponsors from both sides of the aisle, that demonstrates a shared, non-negotiable societal rejection of political violence in the U.S. political process. This wasn't just politics. It was seen, I think, as a response to an act of war against democracy itself. Furthermore, the swift actions taken against individuals who publicly celebrated the murder, and let's be clear, there were many, those were necessary to maintain the basic function of civil society.
You call it civil society maintenance. I'd call it a crackdown, a very targeted one.
Well, look, when a high-level civil servant like U.S. Secret Service agent Anthony Pogg takes to social media suggesting Kirk spewed hate and racism, his words, and is subsequently put on leave, security clearance revoked, that seems like a justified administrative response. These actions, I'd argue, weren't really about ideology per se. They were about protecting the integrity of the political process and, crucially, preventing the assassination from encouraging future attacks. Users were already posting some really violent rhetoric like, "Do Trump next" or "Elon next, please." The priority had to be security and preventing escalation, not suppressing legitimate political dissent.
I see why you emphasize security. I do. But let me offer an alternative reading of that immediate swiftness. It felt to me like a carefully orchestrated political weaponization that went far beyond just security concerns. The aftermath was utilized by high-ranking officials to launch what respected outlets, even the New York Times, described as a conservative version of the cancel culture. They even coined the term the woke right to describe the movement's swift, punitive actions.
But the targets were people celebrating murder. Surely that crosses a moral line that any employer, any institution, has a right to enforce.
They crossed a political line, one that was drawn instantly and, frankly, arbitrarily. Consider maybe the most egregious example of this coercive power, the indefinite suspension of Jimmy Kimmel Live.
Now, Kimmel had simply criticized the MAGA gang, his term, for trying to score political points from the crime rather than engaging in sincere grieving, okay? Yet, within days, the FCC chief is threatening possible regulatory actions against ABC. And then, Nexstar, which, not coincidentally, was simultaneously seeking critical FCC approval for a multi-billion-dollar acquisition, preempted the show on dozens of its affiliated stations. That's not just a complex media environment reacting, that is the chilling effect of regulatory leverage. That's job-owning, pure and simple, achieving censorship without a direct government order.
But private companies make commercial decisions based on public outrage all the time. That happens.
Sure, but the outrage here, I'd argue, was coerced, at least amplified by official political pressure. It silenced a major media voice under that, convenient guise of respecting grief. And furthermore, the very concept of hate speech was instantly redefined for political gain. You had Attorney General Pam Bondi indicating an intent to target speech critical of Kirk as hate speech. Now, as legal experts, like Professor Genevieve Laquier and others, widely noted, the government cannot police discourse based on subjective definitions of hate speech. That's not how the First Amendment works. This wasn't about hate crime prevention. It felt much more like protecting the administration from criticism. I just don't buy that this was some kind of nonpartisan response.
Okay, let's pivot then to the claim of martyrdom. If this was such a successful campaign of censorship, as you suggest, why did the movement Kirk championed seem to only grow stronger? His whole prove me wrong table thing, that was the very symbol of vigorous debate, of challenging the status quo. After his death, Turning Point USA reported receiving this massive influx, 62,000 new student signups. It seems violence failed entirely to silence this conservative youth movement's voice. If anything, it amplified it. Doesn't that demonstrate the resilience of free speech?
That's an interesting data point. Yeah, 62,000. But I would frame the irony quite differently. I mean, it is the height of hypocrisy, arguably, for this movement to claim martyrdom for free speech. Kirk's campus events, they weren't described as good faith discourse by many observers. Consistently, they were called aggressive, unequal, trolling affairs, really designed to provoke and humiliate opponents, not engage them.
But provocation is a necessary part. It's a protected part of political speech.
Okay, but when that provocation is combined with a systematic effort to silence the institutional left, well, the claim of martyrdom starts to ring pretty hollow. This is the organization, remember, that created the Professor Watch List. And for our KaiZen listeners who might not know, this is a public database explicitly designed to intimidate liberal academics. It catalogs their perceived ideological faults, encourages harassment. They were actively building a register of their political enemies. So they cannot simultaneously claim to be the primary victims of free speech attacks while they're actively punishing and intimidating the other side. The movement Kirk built, in the words of one of its own figures, Elijah Schaffer, was based on defining the friend-enemy distinction. Now that sounds like a rhetoric of political warfare, not really protected academic debate.
All right, let's address the severe disciplinary actions taken against critics directly. My position here is that crossing a clear moral line, specifically celebrating a political homicide, that warrants immediate social and, yes, professional disassociation. Society and employers within that society have a clear right to enforce basic moral boundaries.
You define this as enforcing a moral line. I define it as government overreach targeting protected political criticism, because the crackdown focused not merely on the glorification of violence, but on political criticism, even mockery. Look at the data points coming out of Texas. Governor Greg Abbott announced nearly 300 teachers in the state were under investigation for speech criticizing Kirk. 300! That's a massive, chilling intrusion into private expression. It just creates a climate of fear.
But these individuals weren't just criticizing policy, were they? They were engaging in hateful rhetoric, arguably fueled by the assassination itself.
But this targets speech, not action. And that fundamentally contradicts free expression principles. Consider the Texas State University student, expelled and arrested for misdemeanor assault. And what was the allegation? That they argued with a student holding an R.I.P. Charlie Kirk sign and, yes, mocked the death. Arresting and expelling a student for protected expression and mocking behavior, Even behavior that's deeply offensive, that seems like a profound violation of the very First Amendment principles they claim to uphold. Even nonpartisan civil liberties groups, like FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, they condemn these actions. That confirms this goes beyond simple partisan politics. It's a free speech issue.
Well, FIRE's focus is primarily on state actors' compelling speech, right? When a teacher, who is an employee representing the state, celebrates the murder of a political figure, that entity, the state or the school district, has a right to enforce standards of conduct and professionalism. We were dealing with an atmosphere where the celebration of violence could potentially encourage more violence. The line between speech and conduct, it gets blurry when the speech actively endorses political assassination.
But the legal line isn't blurry, generally speaking. Speech that is offensive or even celebrates a tragic event is usually protected. It's speech that incites imminent lawless action that isn't. The mass investigation of 300 teachers, the arrest of a student for arguing and allegedly touching a sign or a hat, it demonstrates, I think, that the goal was leaning towards ideological conformity, not genuinely preventing imminent violence.
Okay, here's a question for everyone listening on the KaiZen channel right now. When does political disagreement become toxic enough to warrant professional separation? Think about it. If someone celebrates the death of your political opponent online, do you think they should be fired by their employer? Pause this right now, give it some thought, and tell us what you think in the comments.
All right, moving on to maybe the most emotionally charged aspect of the aftermath, the memorial service itself. The events surrounding Kirk's memorial delivered, well, a profoundly complex and contradictory message about justice, forgiveness, and political retribution.
Erica Kirk, the victim's widow. Her address showed, I thought, profound Christian charity. She said, "I forgive him," referring to the accused killer, and added, "I do not want that man's blood on my ledger." That honored Kirk's own faith-based mission and represents a kind of high road of reconciliation. It proves that even in tragedy, American values of mercy can sometimes prevail.
That message of profound personal forgiveness, though, it was immediately and very publicly undermined by the movement's single most important political figure. President Trump, sitting right there at the service, publicly contradicted her message. He said, "That's where I disagreed with Charlie. I hate my opponent, and I don't want the best for them. I'm sorry, I am sorry, Erica."
Well, he was acknowledging the reality of the culture war he leads, perhaps. He wasn't necessarily claiming to represent the spiritual view of the movement itself. It was more of a political reality check.
But the juxtaposition is just staggering. The highest political figure of the movement publicly rejecting the central Christian message of mercy offered by the widow at the memorial service. And furthermore, Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller used that exact same memorial stage to declare a righteous fury. And this is the critical part. He vowed to use government resources to destroy progressive nonprofit and political non-governmental organizations, all in Kirk's name. That confirms pretty starkly that the ultimate political goal was state-sponsored retribution and vengeance, completely overriding any spiritual message of mercy.
Miller's rhetoric, I think, reflects the palpable anger many people felt about the perceived celebration of Kirk's death, and maybe the urgent need they felt to address the root cause of the specific targeted violence that killed him.
And that brings us neatly to the ideology of violence itself. While the shooter's motives are undoubtedly complex, President Trump immediately and absolutely blamed the radical left. He even called for a purge of the military. Now, this feels like a cynical political deflection. If you look at the historical data from groups like the Anti-Defamation League, various terrorism databases, they consistently show that politically motivated violence in the U.S. is statistically dominated by right-wing perpetrators. That includes the majority of political killings in recent years. So the absolute, immediate blame assigned to the radical left for this specific act seems to ignore the broader context of where political violence often generates in the U.S.
Okay, but regardless of past statistics or, broad generalizations about extremism, the official focus was, I think, rightly, placed on the specific targeting and motivation in this particular event.
The FBI confirmed the shooting appeared to be a targeted event. Utah prosecutors are pursuing the death penalty, alleging the accused, Robinson, targeted Kirk specifically for his political views. So, given that reality, the condemnation of the left-wing rhetoric that might have fueled this specific targeted act, it was necessary, arguably, to address the current immediate threat.
But you can't just cherry-pick the data points that justify your political attack while ignoring the broader statistical context of political violence. The immediate absolute blame hurled against the radical left by Trump felt like pure hypocritical deflection, aimed, it seemed, at consolidating political power and maybe even excusing future political retribution.
So we've examined this profound tension right at the heart of the national response to the assassination of Charlie Kirk. My view remains that the crackdowns, the political maneuvering, it was a necessary, perhaps messy, but ultimately necessary attempt to restore basic order and condemn political murder, recognizing the unique threat that this kind of violence poses to the political process itself.
And I maintain that the overwhelming evidence, from the suspension of media critics using regulatory coercion to the mass investigation of teachers for speech and that public vow of vengeance right there at the memorial, it exposed a dangerous and, frankly, hypocritical woke right movement. A movement exploiting a tragedy to consolidate power and, in doing so, fundamentally undermine the very free speech principles it claimed to defend.
The source material really forces us to ask, when a figure is simultaneously hailed as, a missionary for Christ and a warrior of culture wars, does the concept of justice even remain unified? Can it? The ultimate answer, as always, lies within the complex material we've just explored together.
So what is your ultimate conclusion, KaiZen listeners? Do you believe the true legacy of this event will be one of martyrdom, validating Kirk's mission in the end, or one of massive hypocrisy, validating the fears of his critics? Let us know what you think down in the comments below. And hey, if you love seeing the evidence-based challenges we bring to light here, make sure you follow the KaiZen channel right now. We appreciate you listening.